Listen to the rain falling tonight, that constant, comforting sound that accompanies us as we explore one of the darkest and most forgotten stories of the 20th century. This is the story of the Duplessis orphans, thousands of children in Quebec, Canada, who were falsely declared mentally ill so the government could receive more money from the federal government. It's a story about institutions that betrayed the most vulnerable, about secrets buried for decades, about children who were stolen from their lives and converted into living ghosts in psychiatric hospitals. There is no music in this tale, only my voice and the rain, because some stories are too somber for embellishments. We begin in Quebec in the 1940s, when Maurice Duplessis was the premier of the province. He was a powerful man, charismatic, deeply Catholic, and absolutely ruthless when it came to maintaining his political control. And under his government, something monstrous began to happen in Quebec's orphanages. Something that would destroy the lives of more than 20,000 children. Let the rain carry you deeper into the story as we uncover how the state and the church conspired to commit one of the most systematic crimes against children in modern Canadian history. Quebec in the 1940s was a deeply Catholic society. The church controlled almost every aspect of social life, education, healthcare, and especially the care of orphans. There were dozens of orphanages run by religious orders, the Grey Nuns, the Sisters of Providence, other congregations that supposedly dedicated their lives to caring for the most vulnerable children. Children arrived at these orphanages for various reasons. Some were true orphans whose parents had died. But many were children of single mothers, children born out of wedlock in a society that considered this the worst of sins. These mothers were forced by their families, by priests, by social pressure, to surrender their babies to the orphanages. They were told it was for the good of the child, that the child would have a better life, that it was the right thing to do. It was a lie, but a lie that the entire society perpetuated. The orphanages received funding from the provincial government for the care of these children. But the funding was minimal, barely enough to feed and clothe them basically. Conditions in many of these orphanages were austere, strict discipline, little affection, limited education. But still, they were orphanages. Children lived in dormitories with other children. They attended rudimentary classes. It wasn't a happy life, but it was a life. That changed in 1954 when Canada's federal government announced a new funding program. They offered significantly higher subsidies for psychiatric hospitals than for orphanages. And Maurice Duplessis saw an opportunity. The calculation was simple and absolutely ruthless. If orphanages were reclassified as psychiatric hospitals, the Quebec government would receive much more money from the federal government. But you could only classify a place as a psychiatric hospital if the children inside were psychiatric patients. So Maurice Duplessis, working with the Catholic religious orders that ran the orphanages, devised a plan. They would declare the orphans mentally ill. Not all of them, that would be too obvious, but thousands of them. The most problematic children, those who asked questions, those who rebelled against strict discipline, those who simply had bad luck. A doctor would visit the orphanage, spend perhaps 5 minutes looking at a group of children, and sign documents declaring them mentally deficient. There were no real examinations, no psychological evaluations, no attempt at honest diagnosis, just a signature on paper that changed a child's status from orphan to mentally ill. And with that signature, everything changed. The orphanage became a psychiatric hospital. The dormitories became wards. The classrooms disappeared because the mentally ill didn't need education. And the children, perfectly healthy and normal children, were labeled with illnesses they never had. Schizophrenia, mental retardation, psychosis, words that would follow them for the rest of their lives. The rain continues falling as we continue this story. And what comes next is even darker. Imagine being a child of 8 or 10 years old, living in an orphanage. Your life isn't happy, but it's predictable. You have friends, other orphans you play with in the courtyard. You have classes where you learn to read and write. You have routines that give you structure. Then one day a doctor arrives. They make you stand in line with other children. He looks at you for a moment, maybe asks you 1 or 2 questions you don't understand. Then he leaves. And the next day, everything changes. They tell you that you're sick now, that something is wrong with your brain, that you can no longer be with the other children in the regular orphanage. They take you to a different building, one that smells of disinfectant and has bars on the windows. They cut your hair very short. They put you in a gray or white uniform. They give you a number. You're no longer a child with a name. You're a patient. The nuns who were strict but predictable before now treat you with a mixture of fear and disdain. Because they've been told you're dangerous, that you're crazy, that you need to be controlled. Education stops completely. Why teach a mentally deficient child to read? Instead, they put you to work, cleaning floors, washing clothes, working in the kitchen. Hard work, physical work, for hours each day. They tell you it's therapy. That work will help you, but really it's free labor to keep the institution running. And the other children in your ward, some of them really are ill. Adults with severe mental illnesses who should be in appropriate facilities but have been mixed with you because the institution is overcrowded. You see things no child should see. You hear screams in the night. And slowly, gradually, you begin to wonder if maybe there really is something wrong with you after all. The rain continues its steady rhythm as we describe the conditions inside these falsified psychiatric hospitals. Extreme overcrowding was the norm. Wards designed for 20 patients held 50 or 60. Children slept in cramped bunk beds, sometimes 2 children sharing a single bed. Hygiene was terrible. Bathrooms were insufficient for the number of people. Children were often forced to wait in long lines to use the toilet, and accidents were common, resulting in severe punishments. Food was scarce and poor quality. Watery porridge for breakfast, thin soup at lunch, stale bread for dinner. Children were constantly hungry, their bodies thin from chronic malnutrition. Abuse was systematic. The nuns and caretakers, frustrated by the impossible task of managing so many children with so few resources, routinely resorted to violence. Beatings with straps, slaps, shoves, confinement in dark closets or isolation rooms for hours or days. Children learned not to cry, not to complain, to become invisible because calling attention usually meant punishment. But perhaps worst was the medical abuse. These places called themselves psychiatric hospitals, so they performed psychiatric treatments on children who had no mental illnesses. Electroshock therapy without anesthesia. Children of 10, 12 years old being restrained while electricity ran through their brains, convulsing, screaming, sometimes biting their own tongues. Lobotomies in some cases, irreversible brain surgery performed on children based on false diagnoses. Forced medication. Potent drugs designed for adult patients being given to small children, leaving them dazed, zombified, unable to think clearly. And all of this was documented as legitimate medical treatment. What makes the Duplessis orphan story even darker is that some of these children were used for medical experiments. Psychiatric hospitals in Quebec in the 1950s and 1960s participated in research studies, testing new medications, experimenting with different forms of therapy. And orphans, children without families to protect them, without anyone to ask questions, were perfect subjects. Pharmaceutical companies tested experimental drugs on these children. New antipsychotics, sedatives, drugs designed to control behavior. Side effects were clinically documented, but the children's suffering was ignored. Some of these experiments were more sinister. There's evidence that some hospitals participated in studies on sensory deprivation, isolating children in dark rooms for days to see how it affected their mental state. Studies on punishment and reward, using extreme behavioral methods that today would be considered torture. There are even allegations, though difficult to prove decades later, that some children were subjected to disease studies, deliberately infected with conditions to study progression and treatment. Medical records of these experiments have mostly disappeared, convenient for the institutions involved. But survivors remember being taken to special rooms, being injected with unknown substances, being observed by doctors who took notes but never explained what they were doing or why. These children weren't patients being treated. They were specimens being studied. And when the experiments ended, they were returned to their overcrowded wards as if nothing had happened. Behind each of these children was a mother, women who had been forced by society to surrender their babies, often barely hours or days after birth. In Quebec of the 1940s and 1950s, becoming pregnant outside of marriage was considered an unforgivable shame. Families sent their daughters to homes for unwed mothers operated by the church. There, young women gave birth in often terrible conditions, with little medical care, treated as sinners who deserved their pain. Immediately after delivery, before the mother could even hold her baby, the child was taken. The mother was told it was for the baby's good, that the child would be adopted by a good Catholic family, that they would have a life she could never provide. Many of these mothers spent the rest of their lives searching for the children who were taken from them. But the system was designed to make reunification impossible. Records were sealed. Identities were changed. And if a mother had the audacity to show up at an orphanage asking about her child, she was turned away, sometimes with cruelty, reminded of her sin and told she had no right to that child. What these mothers didn't know was that many of their children were never adopted. That instead of finding loving families, they were reclassified as mentally ill and locked in institutions. That the healthy baby they'd surrendered believing would have a better life was being abused, medicated, experimented on, slowly destroyed by the same system that promised to care for them. Some mothers finally discovered the truth decades later. They found out that the child they'd imagined growing up happy in an adoptive family had spent 50 years in a psychiatric hospital. And that knowledge shattered them in ways that could never heal. Where are you listening to this story in the rain tonight? What time is it where you are? Let me know in the comments. If you find value in preserving these dark stories so they're not forgotten, subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, and turn on notifications. Now let's continue going deeper into this forgotten horror. Not all children remained in the institutions until adulthood. Some were eventually released, usually around age 18 when funding for their care stopped. But by then, the damage was done. These young people were released to the world without education, without job skills, without family to support them. And they carried in their official files the diagnosis of mental illness that had kept them locked up. Try getting a job when your medical history says you're schizophrenic. Try renting an apartment when government records catalog you as mentally deficient. Try building a life when you spent your entire childhood being treated as a psychiatric patient instead of as a child. Many of these survivors ended up homeless. Others developed real mental health problems, not because they were born with them, but because years of institutional abuse had traumatized them profoundly. Some turned to alcohol or drugs to numb the pain of their memories. Others committed suicide, unable to live with what had been done to them. And for decades, they remained silent. Because who would believe them? They were officially crazy. Their medical files said so. If they tried to tell their story, if they said they'd been normal children falsely diagnosed, who would take seriously someone whose government file said they were mentally ill? The system that had victimized them had also taken away their credibility. It was perfect in its cruelty. The 1960s and 1970s passed. Maurice Duplessis had died in 1959, but the system he created continued. Gradually, some of the psychiatric hospitals began to close as deinstitutionalization became policy across North America. But the former orphans, now adults, still carried their false diagnoses, still lived with the trauma, and still no one spoke publicly about what had happened. The Catholic Church certainly wasn't going to admit its role in the systematic abuse of thousands of children. The Quebec government had no interest in acknowledging it had participated in massive fraud and child abuse. The doctors who had signed the false diagnoses were dead or retired, and those still alive weren't going to admit malpractice. So the silence continued year after year, decade after decade. The survivors aged, carrying their secrets, their scars, their medical files that lied about who they'd been. Some didn't even know there had been others like them. They thought they were alone, that their experience had been singular, that maybe there really had been something wrong with them after all. But in the 1980s, something began to change. Some survivors began to find each other. In mental health support groups, in shelters, on the streets where many had ended up. They began to share their stories. And they realized the details were too similar to be coincidence. The same reclassification methods, the same types of abuse, the same false files. Slowly, painfully, they began to understand that what had happened to them wasn't personal failure or individual bad luck. It was something systematic, something planned, something monstrous that had been done to them deliberately. And once they understood that, they began to organize. In 1992, a group of survivors formed the Committee of Duplessis Institutionalized Orphans. They began speaking publicly, telling their stories to journalists, demanding recognition from the Quebec government and the Catholic Church. At first, they were ignored, then ridiculed. These were people with mental health diagnoses in their files, after all. How could anyone take their accusations seriously? But the survivors persisted. They gathered evidence. They found documents showing how orphanages had been reclassified. They located retired doctors who were willing to admit diagnoses had been made without proper examinations. They tracked down financial records showing how Quebec had received millions in additional federal funds after the reclassifications. The media began to pay attention. Investigative journalists started uncovering the full story. And slowly, the Quebec public began to realize something terrible had happened in their province. That thousands of children had been sacrificed in the name of government funding. That the church and state had conspired in one of the most systematic institutional abuses in modern Canadian history. Pressure on the Quebec government grew. The survivors demanded three things. First, that their medical files be corrected, removing the false diagnoses that had haunted them their whole lives. Second, an official apology recognizing the harm done to them. Third, financial compensation for the lives they'd lost, for the education they'd been denied, for the decades of trauma. The government resisted. Admitting what had happened would mean assuming massive legal responsibility. It would mean acknowledging the state had committed crimes against children. And it would mean paying potentially hundreds of millions of dollars in compensation. So instead, they delayed, denied, minimized. In 1997, the Quebec government finally established a commission to investigate the allegations. But from the beginning, it was clear this wasn't a genuine search for truth. The commission had a limited mandate, couldn't force testimony. It had no power to access all relevant records, and its composition was biased toward those who had an interest in minimizing the scandal. The survivors testified, sharing their painful stories before the commissioners. They described the abuses they'd suffered. They showed their false medical files. They provided evidence of the fraudulent reclassifications. And at the end, the commission issued a tepid report. It acknowledged that mistakes had been made. It admitted some children had been misdiagnosed. But it stopped short of admitting conspiracy or deliberate misconduct. It avoided directly blaming the Duplessis government or the Catholic Church. And it recommended minimal compensation and insulting some given the magnitude of the harm. The survivors were devastated. They'd hoped for justice, validation, real recognition of the horror they'd lived through. Instead, they received a half apology and an offer of money that seemed calculated to insult them. Some accepted the compensation, desperate after decades of poverty. Others rejected it, refusing to let the government buy their silence with such a paltry sum. And the fight continued, though the survivors were aging, though their numbers were dwindling as more died without having seen real justice. One of the darkest aspects of the Duplessis orphan story is what happened to those who died in the institutions. Because many children didn't survive. Some died from medical negligence, treatable illnesses that went untreated because no one cared enough about a child labeled as mentally deficient. Others died during experimental medical procedures that went wrong. Some committed suicide, children so desperate they found ways to end their lives even under institutional surveillance. And some simply died of broken hearts, young bodies that shut down because the spirit within had already been destroyed. These children were buried in cemeteries on the institution grounds. But they weren't proper burials. There were no headstones with names, only numbers. Rows of unmarked graves where children's bodies were placed in cheap coffins or simply wrapped in sheets. Their deaths were often not reported to families, because families had relinquished all rights when they surrendered the children. So the mothers who were still searching for their lost children didn't know that the child they were looking for had died decades ago. buried in an unmarked grave. In recent years, some of these cemeteries have been discovered. Researchers using ground-penetrating radar have found hundreds of unmarked graves on the grounds of former psychiatric hospitals in Quebec. The question now is what to do with them. Exhume the bodies for proper identification? Mark the graves with the names of the children buried there? Or leave them as they are? Another silent reminder of a crime Quebec still struggles to fully acknowledge? Some survivors have visited these cemeteries, standing among the rows of unmarked graves, knowing it could have been them. That the only difference between those who survived and those who lie here was luck or fate or simply the whim of the nuns and doctors, who controlled their lives. The Catholic Church of Quebec has never fully admitted its role in the Duplessis orphan scandal. Despite the fact that it was religious orders that ran the orphanages and psychiatric hospitals, despite the fact that it was nuns and priests who administered much of the abuse, the Church has largely remained silent or offered only the most minimal admissions of error. This is consistent with how the Catholic Church has handled child abuse scandals worldwide. Deny, minimize, protect the institution above protecting victims. But the Church's role in Quebec was particularly extensive because in that era, the Church essentially controlled all social services in the province. They weren't just administrators. They were the system. Some individual religious orders have offered limited apologies. They've acknowledged that the care provided didn't meet standards. They've expressed regret for suffering that occurred. But these apologies generally come with qualifiers. Context about how difficult the times were. Reminders that they were doing the best they could with limited resources. Explanations that, while not justifying the abuse, attempt to make it understandable. Survivors find no comfort in these qualified apologies, because the abuse they suffered wasn't the result of difficulties or resource limitations. It was the result of a system deliberately designed to defraud the federal government and exploit vulnerable children. The nuns who administered the electroshocks, the doctors who signed the false diagnoses, the administrators who converted orphanages into psychiatric hospitals to increase funding. They all knew what they were doing, and the Church that employed them knew too. The Pope has never specifically addressed the Duplessis orphan scandal. In his broader apologies for clerical abuse in Canada, this specific chapter of institutional horror is rarely mentioned. It's as if the Church hopes that, with enough time, the story will simply fade, that the survivors will die, that the public will forget. And to some extent, their strategy has worked. Outside of Quebec, few people know this story. The survivors of the Duplessis orphans are now elderly. Those who were locked up as children in the 1950s are now in their 70s, 80s. Their bodies carry the physical marks of decades of abuse. Scars from beatings, brain damage from repeated electroshocks, dental problems from childhood malnutrition, arthritis and other joint problems from years of forced labor when they were too young. But the psychological scars run even deeper. Complex post-traumatic stress disorder is common among survivors. Nightmares that haunt them decades later. Panic attacks triggered by smells or sounds that remind them of the institutions. Inability to trust authority or institutions. Many were never able to form healthy relationships. Intimacy was impossible when your childhood taught you that affection always came with abuse, that closeness meant vulnerability, that trusting someone meant being hurt. Some survivors never married, never had children of their own, spent their lives in solitude because it was safer than risking connection. Others have families but struggle with the transgenerational effects of trauma. Their children grew up with parents who had nightmares, who overreacted to normal situations, who sometimes shut down emotionally without warning. And these children, now adults themselves, carry their own secondary trauma. Educational achievement among survivors is low because they were denied education during their formative years. They never learned to read well. They never studied mathematics beyond basics. They never learned to read well. They never studied mathematics beyond basics. They never had the opportunity to develop skills that would have enabled professional careers. So many have lived in poverty their entire lives, working low-wage jobs when they could work, depending on welfare when they couldn't. The system impoverished them as children and then never gave them the means to escape that poverty. And now, in their old age, many face their final years without savings, without adequate pensions, still struggling with the consequences of what was done to them 60 or 70 years ago. The rain continues falling. If you find these stories of forgotten injustice important, subscribe to the channel, give it a like, and share. The voices of survivors are fading with time. Let's help ensure they're never completely silenced. One of the most tragic aspects of this story is that not all Duplessis orphans have been identified. The exact number of children affected will never be known with certainty. Estimates range from 20,000 to 30,000, but records are incomplete, deliberately destroyed in some cases. Some children were reclassified from orphans to psychiatric patients but never organized with other survivors. They never knew there was a movement for justice. They spent their lives thinking they were alone in their experience. They died without knowing there had been thousands of others like them. Other survivors are out there but can't speak for themselves. Those who really did develop mental illnesses as a result of trauma, who are now in care homes or institutions, unable to articulate what happened to them. And then there are those whose medical records were so completely falsified that they can no longer prove who they originally were. Their identities were erased when they were reclassified. The names they were given in orphanages were replaced by patient numbers. The families who might have claimed them never knew where they were. There are stories of mothers who spent 50 or 60 years searching for a child, only to die without knowing the child had been 100 kilometers away the whole time, locked in an institution under a false diagnosis. Stories of separated siblings who never knew the other existed because records were sealed or destroyed. There are also children who died without their deaths being properly recorded. Bodies buried in unmarked graves that can never be identified because admission records were lost or intentionally destroyed. In some cases, researchers have found evidence that certain psychiatric hospitals deliberately destroyed records in the 1970s and 1980s when the scandal began emerging. Convenient fires in archive warehouses, floods that destroyed crucial documents, records that simply disappeared without explanation. This destruction of evidence means we'll never have a complete count of how many children were affected, how many died in institutions, how many were subjected to medical experiments. The numbers we have are estimates based on surviving records and survivor testimony. The true magnitude of the horror may be even greater than we know. The Duplessis orphans scandal forced Quebec to confront uncomfortable aspects of its history. For decades, the province had maintained a narrative of itself as a distinct society within Canada, preserving French culture and Catholic values against English-speaking assimilation. But this story revealed the dark side of that system. It showed how the Catholic Church's control over social institutions had enabled massive abuse without oversight. It demonstrated how a corrupt provincial government had prioritized financial gains over child welfare. It exposed the hypocrisy of a society that proclaimed itself deeply religious and family-oriented while systematically destroying thousands of children's lives. The story contributed to Quebec's ongoing secularization. The quiet revolution of the 1960s had already begun the process of reducing the Church's influence. But the Duplessis orphan scandal provided a concrete, visceral reason for Quebecers to reject Catholic institutional power. How could a church that had done this be trusted? It also fed skepticism about governmental institutions. If the state could conspire to falsely declare thousands of children ill for financial gain, what other institutional lies might be hiding? This healthy skepticism has shaped Quebec's political culture to this day. But there was also denial and minimization. Many Quebecers, especially older ones who had lived through the Duplessis era, didn't want to believe such systematic horror had occurred. They insisted survivors were exaggerating or distorting what had happened. They argued conditions couldn't have been as bad as described. This denialism deeply hurt survivors, who had to fight not only against the institutions that had abused them, but also against a society that didn't want to acknowledge that abuse. Quebec wasn't the only place where institutional child abuse occurred at this scale. Ireland had the Magdalene laundries, where unmarried pregnant women and their children were imprisoned and forced to work. Australia had the stolen generations, Aboriginal children taken from their families and placed in institutions. Canada had the Indian residential school system, where First Nations children were separated from their families and cultures. The United States had institutional eugenics and forced sterilization of people deemed mentally deficient. What all these cases have in common is the role of religious institutions, the power of the state to classify and control vulnerable populations, and decades of denial and cover-up before any acknowledgement emerged. But the du Plessis orphans case has unique aspects. The element of financial fraud was particularly blatant, children deliberately misdiagnosed to increase government funding. The number of children affected was staggering for a relatively small time period and geographic area. And the use of psychiatric diagnoses as a tool of oppression created particularly insidious harm because it robbed victims of their credibility along with their childhood. These children couldn't simply tell their story and be believed because their official files labeled them as mentally incompetent. It was gaslighting at an institutional level, the state telling a child they were crazy and then using that false diagnosis to discredit any future accusations the child might make. International recognition of the du Plessis orphans case has been limited. Outside Canada, the story is little known. It hasn't received the same level of global attention as some other institutional abuse scandals. This is partly because Quebec is a French-speaking society within an English-speaking country, creating linguistic and cultural barriers to international awareness. And it's partly because the institutions involved, the Quebec government and Catholic Church, have successfully worked to keep the story contained. Despite decades of activism by survivors, real justice remains elusive. No one has been criminally prosecuted for the systematic abuse of the du Plessis orphans. The doctors who signed false diagnoses never faced malpractice charges. The nuns and administrators who abused children were never held individually accountable. The government officials who designed the fraudulent funding scheme never saw the inside of a courtroom. The main reason is time. By the time survivors achieved public visibility and attention in the 1990s, decades had passed since the worst abuses. Many perpetrators had died. Statutes of limitations had expired on most possible criminal charges. And proving individual abuse cases from 40 or 50 years ago was nearly impossible. The financial compensation eventually offered was insultingly inadequate. In 2001, the Quebec government agreed to pay 10,000 Canadian dollars to each verified survivor. $10,000 for a stolen childhood, for decades of trauma, for an entire lifetime impacted by false diagnoses and institutional abuse. Many survivors rejected the payment as an insult. Others took it because they were desperate, living in poverty after lives of limited opportunities resulting from the abuse they suffered. But taking the money required signing an agreement releasing the government from further liability. It was another way of silencing them. The Catholic Church has never paid any direct compensation to survivors. Despite the fact that religious orders operated the institutions where abuse occurred, the Church has avoided financial responsibility. They've argued they were just contractors providing services to the government, that they followed government policies, that they shouldn't be held liable. It's an argument that conveniently ignores the fact that nuns and priests were the ones who actually administered the physical and emotional abuse day after day. Some survivors have filed individual lawsuits seeking greater compensation. A few have won settlements or judgments, but most have been defeated by the passage of time, by the difficulty of proving specific cases, by the disparity in resources between elderly, impoverished victims versus wealthy institutions. One of the ongoing points of contention is access to records. Many survivors have spent decades trying to obtain their own medical files from the institutions where they were held. These records could provide evidence of the false diagnoses, of the treatments they were subjected to, of the reality of their experiences. But accessing these records has been extraordinarily difficult. Some have been destroyed, as mentioned earlier. Others are sealed under medical privacy laws. Ironically, the same laws designed to protect patient privacy are being used to deny survivors access to information about their own treatment. Institutions argue they must protect medical confidentiality. But survivors point out these are their own records, information about their own treatment, and they should have a right to see it. Some who have obtained their files have found they've been heavily redacted. Names of doctors blacked out. Descriptions of treatments removed. notations that might be incriminating crossed out. What they receive is so incomplete as to be almost useless. The Catholic Church has been particularly resistant to opening its archives. The religious orders that operated the institutions maintain extensive historical records, but they refuse to make them accessible to researchers or survivors, citing privacy and confidentiality. There are suspicions that these archives contain evidence that would be deeply damaging to the Church's reputation. Correspondence between Church officials discussing the reclassification scheme. Internal reports about abuses that were known but not addressed. Financial records that would show exactly how much money flowed from the reclassifications. Without access to these archives, it becomes impossible to fully document the scope of the conspiracy. Historians can't write the complete history, survivors can't fully prove their cases, and the responsible institutions can continue denying, minimizing, and avoiding complete accountability. The Duplessis orphans are aging. Each year, more die, taking their first-hand testimony with them. Within a decade or two, there will be no living survivors left. The question is what kind of memory of this horror will survive after they're gone. There are some monuments and markers. A plaque in Montreal commemorating the Duplessis orphans. Mentions in Quebec history museums. Some books and documentaries that tell the story. But it's notable how little has been done to ensure the story isn't forgotten. There's no national museum dedicated to this history. No official day of remembrance. It's not consistently taught in Quebec schools. This is deliberate. There are powerful forces that would prefer this story to disappear. The Quebec government doesn't want constant reminders of a shameful chapter in provincial history. The Catholic Church certainly doesn't want its role widely remembered. Some older people in Quebec who lived through the Duplessis era don't want to confront what their society allowed to happen. But survivors and their allies are fighting to preserve memory. They've established oral archives, recording testimonies while survivors can still speak. They've worked with academics to document the history. They've pushed for inclusion in school curricula, because they understand that a society that forgets its crimes is doomed to repeat them. Children today need to know that trusted institutions, the state, the church, even the medical profession, can become instruments of abuse when they operate without oversight or accountability. They need to understand that vulnerable populations, orphans, people with mental illnesses, anyone society marginalizes, need special protections precisely because they're vulnerable to exploitation. The rain that has fallen steadily throughout this narrative now begins to ease. But the questions remain. How do we honor the victims? How do we hold institutions accountable? How do we prevent such horrors from happening again? The Duplessis orphans didn't receive justice in their lifetimes. But perhaps their legacy can be a more vigilant, more compassionate society that never again allows children to be sacrificed on the altars of institutional power and financial greed. If this story has moved you, if you believe such stories must be told and remembered, subscribe to this channel. Give this video a like, share it, and most importantly, when you see vulnerability and injustice in your own community, speak up. Because silence is what allowed the Duplessis orphans' horror to continue for decades. And silence is what powerful institutions always hope for when they commit crimes against the vulnerable. Don't give them that silence. Thank you for listening in the rain tonight. May the victims be remembered, and may their stories never be forgotten. Among the survivors who still live are some who have made it their mission to tell the story again and again until they can no longer speak. These are the memory keepers, those who have refused to be silenced by shame or fear or weariness. Bruno Roy was one of them. A writer and activist, he spent decades documenting his own experience and those of other Duplessis orphans. His work helped expose the scandal when others would have preferred to keep it buried. He died in 2018, but his writings remain as testimony. Silvio Day was another. Declared mentally deficient at age 6, he spent 15 years in institutions. After his release, he became one of the key organizers of the survivors movement. He fought tirelessly for recognition and compensation until his death. Alice Quinton, whose story became one of the most publicly known. She was sent to an institution at age 7 with a completely false diagnosis. She suffered years of abuse before finally being released. She dedicated her later life to ensuring others knew what had happened. These individuals faced immense pain in constantly reliving their traumas through public testimony, interviews, and legal proceedings. Each time they told their stories, they had to remember the worst moments of their lives. But they did it because they understood their pain had purpose, that their testimony might prevent other children from suffering similarly, that their refusal to stay silent was itself an act of resistance against the institutions that had tried to erase them. Now that many of these primary spokespeople have died, the responsibility falls to others, to academics who study this period of history, to journalists who continue investigating, to filmmakers who make documentaries, to educators who teach about this history to new generations, and to those of us who listen to these stories in the rainy night, who take the time to learn, to remember, to ensure the voices of the forgotten don't fade completely into silence. What's truly disturbing about the du Plessis orphan story is how many of the factors that allowed it to happen still exist today. Institutions with power over vulnerable populations still operate with insufficient oversight. Children in foster care, people with developmental disabilities, psychiatric patients, still depend on systems that can fail them catastrophically. The financial incentives that led the Quebec government to reclassify children still exist in different forms. Hospitals and other institutions still receive funding based on diagnoses and classifications, creating incentives to overdiagnose or misclassify. The power of the medical profession to label and categorize people remains largely unchecked. A psychiatric diagnosis can still follow someone for life, affecting their employment, housing, child custody, and legal rights. And while we've seen improvements in protections for children, scandals continue to emerge. Residential schools for Indigenous children in Canada where systematic abuse and deaths occurred. Youth detention facilities where children are mistreated. Foster care systems where children disappear or are abused. Each time these scandals emerge, there's shock and outrage, promises of reform, investigations and commissions, and then gradually public attention moves elsewhere. Superficial changes are made, but the fundamental power structures remain. And eventually another scandal emerges. The pattern repeats because we haven't fully addressed the core problem. That when we give institutions power over the vulnerable without robust accountability, without real transparency, without the voices of those impacted being central to oversight, abuse becomes almost inevitable. The du Plessis orphans teach that we need more than good intentions. We need systems built with the assumption that power will be abused unless actively prevented. We need radical transparency in how institutions serving vulnerable populations operate. We need to believe victims when they speak about abuse rather than automatically deferring to institutions. And we need to be willing to hold powerful institutions accountable even when it's uncomfortable or expensive to do so. Until we learn those lessons, stories like the du Plessis orphans will continue to repeat with different names and places but the same fundamental horror. For the remaining survivors of the du Plessis orphans, there will never be true closure. The Quebec government will never fully admit the magnitude of what was done. The Catholic Church will never fully hold itself accountable. Individual perpetrators will never be brought to justice. The lost years can never be recovered. The stolen childhoods can never be returned. The lives they might have lived if they'd been given education and opportunities instead of abuse and neglect remain forever in the realm of what might have been. Some survivors have found personal peace through therapy, community with other survivors, or spiritual faith. They've built meaningful lives despite everything that was done to them. This is a testament to their resilience, not an excuse for the institutions that victimized them. Others remain deeply scarred, unable to fully escape the shadows of their institutional past. They struggle with mental health, addiction, social isolation. These are the ones statistics often miss but whose lives are equally part of the cost of this horror. And then there are those who didn't survive long enough to see even the limited recognition that finally came. Those who died in the institutions or on the streets after being released. Those who committed suicide, unable to live with their memories. Those who succumbed to illnesses related to years of neglect and abuse. For them, there was never any justice at all. Only graves, some marked, many not. The rain has stopped falling now. In the silence that remains, we hold space to remember. To remember the children they were. To remember the lives they should have had. To remember the systematic betrayal by institutions that should have protected the most vulnerable. And in that remembering, we make a commitment that we will tell these stories, that we will not allow them to be forgotten, that we will remain vigilant against the forces that would allow such horrors to repeat. The Duplessis orphans deserved better from their society. They deserved safe childhoods, education, opportunities, love. They never received those things, but we can give them this memory, recognition, and the commitment to fight so that no other children are sacrificed on the altars of institutional power and greed. Thank you for listening to this difficult story in the quiet night. If it has moved you, please share it. Subscribe to the channel for more stories of forgotten crimes and historical injustices. And remember, silence protects perpetrators. Only by speaking, remembering, and demanding accountability can we honor those who suffered and work toward a future where such horrors are truly impossible. Good night. Picture rain falling on the Thames in the early morning hours of June 18, 1982. The sound of water drops hitting the river's surface, mixing with the gentle lapping of waves against the stone pillars of Blackfriars Bridge. A postal clerk named Gordon Payne is walking to work, his footsteps echoing on the wet pavement. He glances down at the muddy bank below and sees something that will haunt him for the rest of his life. A man is hanging from scaffolding beneath the bridge, suspended by an orange rope tied around his neck. The man is wearing an expensive gray suit, now soaked through from the rain. His pockets are stuffed with bricks and stones, weighing him down. In those pockets, police will find nearly $15,000 in various currencies, all carefully arranged. The man's hands show no signs of struggle. His expensive watch is still ticking on his wrist. Everything about the scene is wrong, methodically wrong, as if someone wanted to send a message that only certain people would understand. The dead man is Roberto Calvi, chairman of Italy's largest private bank. He is known as God's banker because of his deep connections to the Vatican. And his death beneath Blackfriars Bridge will open a door into a world of secrets that powerful people would kill to keep hidden. This is not just a murder mystery. This is a story about how money, religion, and power became so entangled that telling where one ends and another begins became impossible. Let the rain sounds carry you deeper into the story as we unravel what really happened to the man they called God's banker. Roberto Calvi was born in Milan in 1920, the son of a bank manager. From childhood, he understood the language of money, the quiet conversations in offices where futures were decided, where fortunes were made and lost with a signature. He was methodical, precise, the kind of man who measured everything twice before making a move. By 1947, he had joined Banco Ambrosiano, a Catholic bank with deep ties to the Vatican. The bank's name came from Saint Ambrose, the patron saint of Milan, and it prided itself on serving the faithful. But Calvi saw something more in Banco Ambrosiano. He saw potential, connections, opportunities that most people would never notice. He rose steadily through the ranks, never making enemies, always being useful to the right people. By 1975, he was chairman, the most powerful banker in Italy. But Calvi's genius wasn't just in traditional banking. He understood something that few others did in those years. He understood that money needed to move in shadows sometimes, that there were people and organizations who needed financial services that couldn't be traced, transactions that couldn't be questioned. He built a network of shell companies in tax havens, a labyrinth of accounts and transfers that even expert accountants struggled to follow. And he made himself indispensable to powerful institutions, particularly one institution that had more secrets than any other. The Vatican Bank, officially known as the Institute for the Works of Religion, needed someone who understood how to move money discreetly. And Roberto Calvi became their man. The partnership that would eventually lead to his death beneath a London bridge was beginning to form. Let the rain continue in the background as we explore how a banker from Milan became intertwined with the Roman Catholic Church. The Vatican Bank is unlike any other financial institution in the world. It operates without transparency, answering to no regulatory body, hidden behind centuries of tradition and religious authority. In the 1970s, Archbishop Paul Marcinkus ran the Vatican Bank. He was an American from Chicago, a large man with a practical approach to finance. He understood that the church needed money to operate its global mission, and he wasn't squeamish about where that money came from or how it was managed. Calvi and Marcinkus found each other. The banker who knew how to move money invisibly and the archbishop who needed money moved. Together, they created something unprecedented. Banco Ambrosiano became the Vatican Bank's main conduit for international transactions. Calvi would take deposits from the Vatican, funnel them through his network of shell companies, and return them cleaned, multiplied, untraceable. It was a perfect arrangement for everyone involved. The Vatican got financial growth without scrutiny. Calvi got power and the protection of the church. But there were others in this arrangement, silent partners who stayed in the shadows. Calvi was also moving money for less holy purposes. The Sicilian mafia needed ways to launder drug money. Political parties needed secret funding that couldn't appear on official records. Intelligence agencies from various countries needed untraceable accounts for covert operations. And there were whispers of an organization called Propaganda 2 or P2, a secret Masonic lodge that had infiltrated the highest levels of Italian government, business, and military. Calvi was their banker too. He was everyone's banker, and that made him the most dangerous man in Italy, because he knew everything. Every secret transaction, every hidden account, every illegal deal. And as long as he stayed loyal and kept quiet, he was protected. But if he ever decided to talk, or if he became a liability, well, that's when things would become complicated. By 1981, the carefully constructed world Roberto Calvi had built was beginning to crack. Italian investigators had started looking into Banco Ambrosiano's international dealings. They couldn't quite understand the complex web of shell companies and offshore accounts, but they knew something wasn't right. The numbers didn't add up. Money was disappearing into foreign subsidiaries that seemed to exist only on paper. Calvi was called to testify. He was calm, professional, giving answers that sounded reasonable but explained nothing. He had decades of practice making complicated financial arrangements seem legitimate. But the pressure was building. In July 1981, Calvi was arrested for illegal currency exportation. It was a minor charge, really just a crack in the facade. But it was enough. He spent time in jail, and during those weeks behind bars, something changed in Roberto Calvi. People who knew him said he became paranoid, constantly looking over his shoulder, jumping at unexpected sounds. He started carrying a pistol. He hired bodyguards. He would check his car for bombs before getting in each morning. His family noticed the change. His wife Clara said he wasn't sleeping, that he would wake in the middle of the night in a cold sweat, muttering about people who were after him. His daughter said he seemed like a man who knew too much and was terrified of what would happen when others found out. Calvi was convicted in 1981 and sentenced to 4 years in prison. But he appealed and remained free while the case moved through Italy's slow judicial system. During this time, investigators were digging deeper into Banco Ambrosiano's finances, and what they were finding was catastrophic. The bank was missing over $1 billion. It had been hidden through Calvi's network of shell companies, but now that network was being exposed. The money was gone, lost in a maze of fraudulent transactions and bad loans. And the people who had trusted Calvi with their secrets, with their dirty money, were realizing that he might not be able to protect them anymore. Listen to the rain and understand that some organizations operate entirely in shadows, and P2 was one of the darkest. Propaganda 2 was officially a Masonic lodge, but it was something far more sinister. Founded and led by Licio Gelli, a fascist sympathizer with connections to everyone from Italian politicians to South American dictators, P2 had infiltrated Italian society at every level. Members included cabinet ministers, military generals, intelligence chiefs, journalists, and businessmen. They had a plan, documented in papers later seized by police, to effectively take over the Italian government through a combination of corruption, blackmail, and strategic violence. Roberto Calvi was a member of P2. More than that, he was their banker. He moved money for them, hid their transactions, made their corruption financially possible. But being P2's banker meant owing loyalty to Licio Gelli, and Gelli was not a man who tolerated failure or betrayal. As the investigation into Banco Ambrosiano intensified, P2's secrets were at risk of exposure. The lodge's membership list was discovered by police in 1981, causing a massive scandal. Government ministers resigned. Military officers were arrested. The entire organization was supposedly disbanded. But everyone knew that P2 hadn't really gone away. It had just gone deeper underground. And now their banker, the man who knew where all the money had gone and who it had gone to, was in trouble. Calvi started receiving threats. Anonymous phone calls in the middle of the night. Cars following him through the streets of Milan. Strange men watching his house. He told his family he was being pressured to stay quiet, to take full responsibility for Banco Ambrosiano's collapse and not implicate anyone else. The message was clear. Go to prison quietly, do your time, and when you get out, you'll be taken care of. But if you talk, if you name names, if you expose what's really been happening, then you won't live long enough to testify. Where are you listening from tonight? What time is it where you are? Let me know in the comments, because I love knowing that people all over the world are discovering these stories. And if you're finding this helpful for sleep or just fascinated by this case, please subscribe to the channel, hit that like button, and turn on notifications so you never miss another story. Now let's continue with the reign and Roberto Calvi's final days. By June 1982, Roberto Calvi knew he was running out of time. The investigation had revealed that Banco Ambrosiano was essentially bankrupt, missing over $1.3 billion. The Bank of Italy was preparing to take control of the institution. Criminal charges were inevitable, and the people Calvi had served, whose secrets he had protected for decades, were making it clear that they couldn't let him be interrogated by prosecutors. On June 10, 1982, Calvi made his decision. He would run. Using a false passport under the name John Roberto Calvini, he fled Italy. He left behind his wife Clara, his daughter Anna, his son Carlo. He told them he needed to get away, to find evidence that would prove he'd been acting under orders from higher powers, that he'd been following instructions from the Vatican Bank and other institutions. He promised he would clear his name and return. His journey was strange and circuitous. First to Austria, then to London, moving through a network of safe houses and hotels, never staying in one place for long. He was accompanied by a small group of people, though their exact identities and loyalties remain unclear to this day. Some say they were helping him. Others believe they were escorting him to his death. In London, Calvi stayed in a modest apartment in Chelsea. He made phone calls, dozens of them, trying to reach people who might help him. He called the Vatican, begging for Archbishop Marcinkus to intervene, to publicly acknowledge that he'd been acting on the Church's behalf. Those calls went unreturned. He called Italian politicians who owed him favors. They wouldn't take his calls. He called members of P2. They told him to stay quiet and wait for instructions. He was alone now, abandoned by everyone he'd served. The protection he thought he'd earned through decades of service had evaporated. And in those final days in London, Roberto Calvi must have realized that he'd become a liability that needed to be eliminated. On the evening of June 17, 1982, Roberto Calvi made a final phone call to his daughter Anna back in Italy. His voice on that call, which was recorded by investigators who were monitoring the Calvi family, reveals a man who knew he was in mortal danger. He told Anna that he was afraid, that people were following him, that he didn't know who to trust anymore. He said he had documents that would expose everything, that would prove he'd been following orders, that would bring down powerful people in the Vatican, in P2, in the Italian government. He told her he was going to meet someone that night who might be able to help him. He didn't say who. He promised to call her the next day. He never did. What happened in the hours between that phone call and when Roberto Calvi's body was found hanging beneath Blackfriars Bridge has been debated for decades. The official story, the one initially accepted by British police, was suicide. They said Calvi, facing financial ruin and criminal prosecution, had taken his own life. He'd somehow obtained bricks and stones, stuffed them in his pockets, climbed down scaffolding beneath the bridge in the middle of the night, and hanged himself. But nothing about that story made sense. Calvi was terrified of heights. Multiple witnesses confirmed he couldn't even stand on a balcony without feeling dizzy. The idea that he'd voluntarily climbed down scaffolding in the dark was absurd. The bricks in his pockets were arranged too carefully, almost ritually. The amount of money found on his body, exactly divided between different currencies, seemed symbolic rather than random. And forensic experts would later point out that there were no marks on his hands consistent with climbing down scaffolding, no dirt under his fingernails, no defensive wounds of any kind. Roberto Calvi didn't commit suicide beneath Blackfriars Bridge. Someone put him there. Someone wanted his death to look a certain way, to send a specific message. But to understand that message, you need to understand the symbolism of the location. Let the rain sounds continue as we explore why Blackfriars Bridge matters so much in this story. In Masonic tradition, Blackfriars are brothers who have betrayed the lodge. They're marked men, traitors who must be punished. The choice of Blackfriars Bridge as the location for Roberto Calvi's body was not accidental. It was a message as clear as a signed confession to those who understood the code. The bricks in his pockets, the scaffolding, the position of the body, all of it had Masonic symbolism. In Masonic ritual, betrayal is punished through symbolic executions that mirror the crime. A brother who steals from the lodge might be found with money in his pockets. A brother who builds a fortune on lies might be found among construction materials. Roberto Calvi had betrayed P2. Whether intentionally or simply by becoming a liability, he'd put the organization at risk. His arrest, his threatened cooperation with investigators, his possession of documents that could expose members, all of this made him a Blackfriar in their eyes. And the punishment for that betrayal had to be public enough to be seen, symbolic enough to be understood by other potential traitors, yet mysterious enough that authorities couldn't easily prove what had happened. Licio Gelli, the head of P2, had fled to Switzerland by the time Calvi died. But his organization still operated. They still had members in positions of power. They still had resources and reach. And they had connections to groups that specialized in making problems disappear. The Sicilian Mafia had used Calvi's banking network. They'd lost money when Banco Ambrosiano collapsed. They had their own reasons to want him dead. And they had the skills to carry out a killing that would look like suicide to casual observers but would be understood as murder by those who needed to understand it. British police initially treated Roberto Calvi's death as suicide. It seemed straightforward to them, a desperate man taking his own life. But the Italian authorities immediately suspected murder. They'd been investigating Calvi for months. They knew about his connections to organized crime, to P2, to the Vatican Bank. They knew he'd been receiving death threats. The Calvi family hired private investigators and forensic experts. They commissioned independent autopsies. And slowly, methodically, evidence began to emerge that contradicted the suicide theory. Calvi's body showed traces of paint that matched the color of a boat, suggesting he'd been transported to the bridge by water, not that he'd walked there. His lungs contained no water, meaning he hadn't been breathing when his body entered the Thames. He was already dead when he was hanged. The angle of the rope around his neck was inconsistent with suicide by hanging. It was more consistent with strangulation followed by staging. Timeline analysis showed it would have been nearly impossible for Calvi to reach that location and position himself in that way in the time available. Witnesses came forward saying they'd seen a group of men near Blackfriars Bridge on the night in question, carrying something heavy. But despite this accumulating evidence, the British investigation moved slowly, hampered by jurisdictional issues and the sheer complexity of the case. This wasn't just a murder. This was international conspiracy involving multiple countries, organized crime, Masonic lodges, and the Vatican. The deeper investigators dug, the more powerful the people they found. And powerful people have ways of making investigations stall. Years would pass. Decades would pass. And the full truth of what happened to Roberto Calvi would remain stubbornly out of reach, protected by layers of secrecy and the selective amnesia of those who knew what really happened that night beneath Blackfriars Bridge. One of the most damning aspects of the Roberto Calvi case is the Vatican's response, or rather, their lack of response. When Calvi died, the Vatican Bank was exposed as deeply involved in Banco Ambrosiano's fraudulent activities. Documents showed that Archbishop Marcinkus had co-signed letters that effectively guaranteed Banco Ambrosiano's loans to shell companies. These letters made it appear that the Vatican Bank was backing these transactions, giving them legitimacy they didn't deserve. When Banco Ambrosiano collapsed, creditors demanded that the Vatican honor these guarantees. The Church initially refused, claiming the letters were forgeries or that Marcinkus had exceeded his authority. But eventually, facing intense pressure and the threat of massive lawsuits, the Vatican agreed to pay $244 million to Banco Ambrosiano's creditors without admitting any wrongdoing. It was one of the largest financial settlements in Vatican history, a tacit admission that they'd been involved in Calvi's schemes even if they wouldn't say so publicly. But what the Vatican never did was cooperate with the murder investigation. Archbishop Marcinkus refused to testify. The Vatican claimed diplomatic immunity, pointing out that Vatican City is a sovereign state and its officials can't be compelled to appear in Italian or British courts. Marcinkus remained safe behind Vatican walls until the statute of limitations on related charges expired. He eventually left Vatican Bank leadership but never faced any criminal prosecution. He died in 2006, taking whatever he knew about Roberto Calvi and their financial arrangements to his grave. The Vatican's silence spoke volumes. If Calvi had truly been acting alone, if the Church had been an innocent victim of his fraud, they would have been eager to cooperate with investigators to expose him. Instead, they circled the wagons, protected their officials, and paid whatever was necessary to make the problem go away. This behavior suggested that Roberto Calvi had indeed been acting with Vatican knowledge and approval, that he'd been doing exactly what Church officials wanted him to do. And when he became a liability, when his arrest threatened to expose their involvement, they cut all ties and let him face the consequences alone. Make sure you're subscribed because this story gets even more complex. Hit that like button and turn on notifications. Let the rain continue as we dive deeper into the conspiracy that killed God's banker. While P2 and the Vatican had reasons to want Calvi dead, the Sicilian Mafia had perhaps the most concrete motive. In the years before his death, Roberto Calvi had moved hundreds of millions of dollars for mafia families through his network of shell companies. This wasn't just money laundering in the traditional sense. Calvi was investing mafia money in legitimate businesses, real estate, and financial instruments, helping to transform drug profits into clean capital. The arrangement worked well until Banco Ambrosiano's collapse. When the bank went under, mafia money went with it. Hundreds of millions of dollars simply vanished into the maze of bankrupt shell companies and uncollectible loans. The families who had entrusted their money to Calvi wanted it back, and they wanted answers about where it had gone. Francesco Di Carlo, a Sicilian mafioso who later became an informant, claimed he was present at meetings where Calvi's fate was discussed. According to Di Carlo, the decision to kill Calvi was made by a consortium of interests, mafia families, yes, but also members of P2, and with tacit approval from certain Vatican officials who wanted to ensure Calvi could never testify about their involvement in his schemes. Di Carlo said the actual killing was carried out by mafia hitmen who specialized in making murders look like accidents or suicides. They'd flown to London, grabbed Calvi from his apartment, likely drugged him to keep him docile, took him by boat down the Thames to Blackfriars Bridge, strangled him, and then staged the scene to send the message about Masonic betrayal while also creating enough ambiguity that police might rule it suicide. The plan had worked, at least initially, but Di Carlo's testimony, given years later, couldn't be fully corroborated. He knew details about the killing that hadn't been made public, suggesting he had insider knowledge. But he also had reasons to lie, to exaggerate his importance, to tell investigators what they wanted to hear in exchange for protection and reduced sentences on his own crimes. Still, his account matched what forensic evidence suggested, that Calvi had been killed elsewhere and his body positioned beneath the bridge, that multiple people were involved, that the murder was professional, planned, symbolic, and that the people who ordered it had connections that reached from the streets of Sicily to the halls of Vatican City. Licio Gelli deserves his own chapter in this story because understanding him is essential to understanding what happened to Roberto Calvi. Born in 1919, Gelli had lived through fascist Italy, had connections to Mussolini's regime, and after World War II had somehow transformed himself into a respected businessman despite his fascist past. But Gelli's real power came from P2, which he transformed from a traditional Masonic lodge into something far more sinister, a shadow government within Italy. His membership list read like a who's who of Italian power. 3 cabinet ministers, 43 members of parliament, 43 generals and admirals, hundreds of senior civil servants, industrialists, magistrates, and journalists. With these connections, Gelli could influence virtually any aspect of Italian life. He could shape media coverage, direct police investigations, influence judicial decisions, and manipulate political processes. He was the puppet master, and Italy was his theater. Roberto Calvi had been recruited into P2 in the early 1970s. Gelli recognized that controlling Italy's finances was crucial to controlling Italy itself. With Calvi managing Banco Ambrosiano and the Vatican Bank connection, P2 had access to unlimited funds that could be moved invisibly around the world. But when Banco Ambrosiano began to collapse, Gelli's position became precarious. The P2 membership list had already been exposed in 1981. He'd fled to Switzerland and then to South America, evading arrest. But his organization still operated, and it still needed to protect its secrets. Calvi had been Gelli's banker, but he'd also been present at P2 meetings. He knew who the members were. He knew what they'd discussed. He knew about plans that had never been implemented, crimes that had never been officially linked to the lodge, corruption that had never been exposed. And now he was in the custody of police, facing the prospect of long prison sentences unless he cooperated and provided information about his accomplices. From Gelli's perspective, Calvi had become an existential threat. He couldn't be allowed to testify. He couldn't be allowed to trade information for leniency. He had to be silenced permanently. One of the enduring mysteries of the Calvi case involves the people who accompanied him during his final days in London. Calvi hadn't traveled alone. Several individuals were with him at various points, helping him move between safe houses, arranging meetings, supposedly working to help him escape or find evidence to clear his name. But who were these people really? And were they helping him or leading him to his death? One name that emerged during investigations was Flavio Carboni, a Sardinian businessman with connections to both legitimate commerce and organized crime. Carboni had befriended Calvi in the months before his death, supposedly offering to help him navigate his legal troubles. Carboni was in London when Calvi died. He helped arrange Calvi's false passport. He knew where Calvi was staying, and according to some witnesses, he was one of the last people to see Calvi alive. When questioned, Carboni claimed he'd been trying to help Calvi escape and find documents that would prove his innocence. He said he left Calvi at the Chelsea apartment on the night of June 17th and knew nothing about what happened after that. But investigators suspected Carboni was actually working for interests that wanted Calvi dead, that he'd gained Calvi's trust specifically to position him for assassination, that everything about the escape plan had been a setup from the start. Also present in London was Silvano Vitter, Carboni's associate, and there was mention of other shadowy figures, people whose identities were never fully established, who seemed to appear and disappear from the story at convenient moments. Were these people mafia contractors, P2 operatives, intelligence agents? The question of who actually carried out the killing has never been definitively answered. But what seems clear is that Roberto Calvi didn't realize he was being escorted to his execution. He thought he was running to safety. Instead, he was being delivered to the people who wanted him dead. It would take years for anyone to be charged with Roberto Calvi's murder. In 1991, nearly a decade after the death, the official verdict was finally changed from suicide to murder. This was largely due to the persistence of Calvi's family and their lawyers, who never accepted the suicide theory and continued to push for investigation. But charging someone with the murder proved incredibly difficult. The crime had occurred in London, but the conspirators were in Italy and elsewhere. Witnesses were scarce or unreliable. Physical evidence was limited, and the people suspected of ordering or carrying out the killing had powerful connections and expensive lawyers. In 2005, More than 2 decades after Calvi's death, a trial finally took place in Rome. 5 defendants were charged with murder: Flavio Carboni, Carboni's girlfriend Manuela Kleinsig, mafia financier Ernesto Diotolivi, Sardinian businessman Silvano Vitter, and mafia boss Giuseppe Callo. The prosecution argued that these individuals had conspired to kill Calvi because of money he owed to mafia families and because of the risk he posed as someone who knew too much about criminal operations involving P2, the mafia, and the Vatican Bank. The trial revealed disturbing details about the conspiracy. Witnesses testified about meetings where Calvi's death was discussed. Phone records showed suspicious calls between defendants around the time of the murder. Financial records revealed payments that might have been for hiring killers, but proving beyond reasonable doubt that these specific individuals had carried out or ordered this specific murder was nearly impossible given the passage of time and the complexity of the conspiracy. In June 2007, all 5 defendants were acquitted due to insufficient evidence. The judge acknowledged that Calvi had almost certainly been murdered as part of a conspiracy involving multiple parties, but said the evidence wasn't strong enough to convict these particular defendants. The Calvi family was devastated. After 25 years of fighting for justice, the people they believed had killed their husband and father walked free. Roberto Calvi's murder remains officially unsolved to this day. In the wake of the Banco Ambrosiano scandal and Roberto Calvi's death, the Vatican was forced to confront its financial practices. The relationship with Calvi had exposed the Vatican Bank to international scrutiny and criticism. The Church's finances, which had operated for centuries with virtually no transparency, were suddenly subject to questions from regulators, prosecutors, and the public. The Vatican implemented reforms throughout the 1980s and 1990s. They brought in outside auditors. They agreed to cooperate with some international financial regulations. They promised greater transparency in their operations. But critics argued these reforms were largely cosmetic. The Vatican Bank continued to operate with far less oversight than any other financial institution of comparable size. It still held accounts for suspicious individuals and organizations. It still facilitated transactions that couldn't be traced. Archbishop Marcinkus was quietly moved out of Vatican Bank leadership in 1989, but he faced no punishment for his role in the Banco Ambrosiano affair. He returned to the United States and lived comfortably until his death in 2006, protected by Vatican immunity from ever having to testify about his dealings with Roberto Calvi. The question that haunts this case is simple. What did Vatican officials know about Calvi's activities, and when did they know it? Were they active participants in money laundering and fraud, or were they naive victims of a clever banker? The evidence strongly suggests the former. The Vatican Bank wasn't just a client of Calvi's schemes. It was a partner. Church officials knew money was being moved through questionable channels. They knew Calvi was dealing with unsavory characters. They knew his network of shell companies existed specifically to hide money and evade regulations. And they continued working with him because it was profitable for the church, because it allowed them to grow their financial holdings without the transparency that would have come from using legitimate banking channels. When Calvi became a liability, when his arrest threatened to expose their involvement, the Vatican cut him loose. They didn't help him escape. They didn't provide lawyers. They didn't acknowledge their partnership. They let him die alone beneath Blackfriars Bridge, and then they paid a settlement to make the scandal go away without ever admitting what they'd really been doing. Whenever a case involves powerful institutions, organized crime, and an unsolved murder, conspiracy theories multiply. The Roberto Calvi affair has inspired dozens of theories, some plausible, others fantastical. One theory suggests that Calvi wasn't killed because of money or to prevent him from testifying. Instead, he was killed because he discovered something even more dangerous: secret financial connections between the Vatican and intelligence agencies during the Cold War. According to this theory, the Vatican Bank was being used by the CIA and other Western intelligence services to funnel money to anti-communist groups in Eastern Europe and Latin America, and Calvi had stumbled onto evidence of these operations. Another theory proposes that Calvi's death was actually ordered by shadowy international banking interests who saw him as a threat to the emerging global financial system. His network of unregulated offshore accounts and shell companies was an early version of what would later become common practice, but in the early 1980s, traditional banks saw this as competition that needed to be eliminated. Some researchers have suggested connections to the attempted assassination of Pope John Paul II in 1981. They point out that the gunman, Mehmet Ali Agca, had connections to organized crime groups that also used Calvi's banking services. They theorized that the same conspiracy that tried to kill the Pope might have eventually killed Calvi to cover up the financial trail. There are even theories that involve Cold War politics at the highest level, suggesting that Calvi's death was approved or even arranged by intelligence services who needed to protect secrets about how the West funded anti-communist operations. These theories are difficult to prove or disprove because they involve organizations and individuals who operate in secrecy. Intelligence agencies don't release files about operations from the 1980s. The Vatican doesn't open its archives. Organized crime families don't publish their financial records. What we're left with is fragments of information, testimony from people with questionable motives, documents that raise more questions than they answer, and a body of evidence that suggests a massive conspiracy but can't quite prove exactly who was involved or why. After fleeing Italy in 1981, Licio Gelli, the Grand Master of P2, lived as a fugitive for years. He moved between Switzerland, Uruguay, and other countries that didn't have strong extradition treaties with Italy. But eventually, in 1987, he was arrested in Switzerland while trying to withdraw money from a Swiss bank account. He was carrying a false passport and had attempted to disguise his appearance. Swiss authorities prepared to extradite him to Italy, where he faced charges related to the Banco Ambrosiano fraud and his role in P2's illegal activities. But in a twist that seemed almost too perfect, Gelli escaped from Swiss custody. He managed to get out of his prison hospital room, despite being 68 years old and under guard, and fled to South America. He lived freely in Uruguay for several years, apparently protected by connections he'd built over decades of international intrigue. Finally, in 1998, Italian commandos working with French police captured Gelli at Nice airport. He was brought back to Italy to finally face justice for his role in the greatest political and financial scandal in modern Italian history. But Gelli's trials were complicated affairs. He faced multiple charges: conspiracy, fraud, involvement in terrorist activities, and more. Some charges resulted in convictions, others in acquittals. He spent time in prison but was often released on appeal or for health reasons. The man who had once controlled a secret government within Italy, who had connections to everyone from mafia bosses to Vatican officials to South American dictators, ended up serving relatively little prison time. He remained defiant to the end, insisting that P2 had been patriots trying to save Italy from communism, that everything they'd done had been justified by the political situation of the time. Licio Gelli died in 2015 at the age of 96. To the end, he never fully explained his relationship with Roberto Calvi, never admitted to ordering or approving the banker's death, never revealed all the secrets of P2's activities during those years. Whatever he knew about what really happened beneath Blackfriars Bridge died with him. One more voice that could have explained this mystery choosing instead to stay silent. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that like button. Turn on notifications for more deep dives into historical mysteries and true crime. Let the rain carry you through the final chapters of God's banker's story. For Roberto Calvi's widow Clara and his children, Anna and Carlo, the years after his death became consumed with seeking justice and clearing his name. They never accepted the suicide verdict. They knew Roberto, knew his fears, knew he'd been running from people who wanted him dead. The family hired investigators, forensic experts, lawyers, anyone who might help prove what they already knew: that Roberto had been murdered. Clara Calvi spent years traveling between Italy and London, meeting with police, providing documents, pushing for the investigation to continue. She faced skepticism and resistance. Many authorities seemed content to let the case remain closed as suicide. Reopening it would mean confronting powerful institutions and people who didn't want to be confronted. Anna Calvi became particularly outspoken about the case. She gave interviews, appeared in documentaries, wrote articles about her father. She argued that he'd been a scapegoat, blamed for crimes that had actually been committed by or on behalf of far more powerful people. She maintained that if Roberto had been allowed to testify, if he'd been protected instead of abandoned, he could have exposed corruption that reached into the highest levels of Italian society and the Vatican itself. The family's persistence eventually paid off. In 1991, the official verdict was changed from suicide to murder. In 2002, Calvi's body was exhumed for new forensic tests, which confirmed what the family had always believed. He'd been killed before being hung beneath the bridge. But the 2007 acquittal of all defendants in the murder trial was a devastating blow. After 25 years of fighting, the people they believed responsible walked free. Clara Calvi died in 2010, never having seen anyone convicted for her husband's murder. Her children continue to speak about the case, to share documents, to keep public attention focused on the unsolved crime. They've pursued their quest not just for justice, but to restore Roberto Calvi's reputation. In their eyes, he wasn't the criminal mastermind the media portrayed. He was a banker who'd gotten caught up in systems of corruption far larger than himself, who'd served powerful interests, and who'd been sacrificed when he became inconvenient. Whether that's the full truth or a family's natural desire to see their father in the best light possible is something each person must decide for themselves. But their dedication to seeking answers, their refusal to accept easy explanations, their persistence in the face of institutional resistance, all of this has kept the case alive in public consciousness and has gradually revealed more about the conspiracy that killed Roberto Calvi. The Roberto Calvi case changed how we understand the intersection of finance, religion, and organized crime. It exposed the Vatican Bank's willingness to engage in questionable financial practices. It revealed how easily money could be laundered through networks of shell companies in the pre-internet era. It showed how secret societies like P2 could infiltrate democratic governments. And it demonstrated how difficult it is to investigate and prosecute conspiracies that involve powerful institutions with resources and connections that span multiple countries. The case influenced Italian politics for decades. The P2 scandal led to reforms in how Masonic lodges are regulated. The Banco Ambrosiano collapse led to stricter banking regulations. The Vatican's involvement forced the Church to implement financial reforms it had resisted for centuries. But beyond the institutional changes, the case left behind questions that remain relevant today. How much secret power do unelected officials in religious institutions wield? How can we prevent banking systems from being used for money laundering and fraud when financial transactions have become so complex that even experts struggle to track them? How do we investigate crimes when the criminals have connections at the highest levels of government and law enforcement? The term God's banker became shorthand for the dangerous mixing of religious authority and financial power. It represented how institutions we're taught to trust can be deeply compromised, how money corrupts even supposedly holy endeavors, how secrecy enables abuse. Roberto Calvi's life and death serve as a warning about what happens when financial systems operate without transparency, when religious institutions prioritize their wealth over their stated values, when criminal organizations are allowed to infiltrate legitimate businesses and governments. His body hanging beneath Blackfriars Bridge was a message to other potential whistleblowers. Speak out and this is what happens. But it was also, inadvertently, a message to the public. Look what's being done in your name with your money by people and institutions you trust. The conspiracy that killed Roberto Calvi wanted to hide the truth. Instead, his death exposed more than his testimony ever could have. Listen to the rain falling on the Thames. Picture Blackfriars Bridge at dawn, the grey water flowing beneath, the old stones that have witnessed so much of London's history. Somewhere in that river, somewhere in those stones, the truth of what happened to Roberto Calvi on the night of June 17, 1982, remains hidden. We know he was murdered. We know it involved conspiracy between multiple parties with different but overlapping motives. We know the mafia wanted their money back and wanted to punish him for losing it. We know P2 needed to ensure he couldn't expose their secrets. We know the Vatican had every reason to want him silenced before he could testify about their financial crimes. But we don't know exactly who strangled him, who transported his body to the bridge, who positioned it so carefully beneath the scaffolding. We don't know if those who gave the orders faced any real consequences. We don't know how many other secrets died with Roberto Calvi that night. His case remains officially unsolved. The killers were never convicted. The conspiracy was never fully exposed. Justice, in the traditional sense, was never achieved. But perhaps there's another kind of justice in how the case has refused to be forgotten. How new evidence continues to emerge decades later. How researchers and journalists continue to investigate. How the Calvi family never gave up their quest for truth. Roberto Calvi's story is a reminder that powerful people and institutions can commit terrible crimes and escape punishment, at least in this life. But it's also a reminder that truth has a way of seeping out eventually, like water through cracks in old stones, patient and persistent and ultimately impossible to contain completely. The rain still falls on Blackfriars Bridge. The Thames still flows to the sea. And somewhere in the evidence, in the documents, in the testimony of those who know more than they've said, the full truth waits. Maybe someday someone will finally bring it to light. Until then, we remember Roberto Calvi, God's banker, the man who knew too much, who served too many masters, who discovered too late that in the world he'd chosen to inhabit, loyalty runs only one direction, and the price of betrayal or even just inconvenience is death beneath a bridge in the rain. If this story has kept you company through the night, if you found it helpful for sleep or simply fascinating, please subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, and share it with anyone interested in true crime, unsolved mysteries, and the dark side of institutional power. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts on who you think killed Roberto Calvi and why. And remember, the most interesting stories are often the ones that remain unfinished, the mysteries that refuse to be solved, the questions that continue to haunt us long after the rain has stopped falling. Thank you for listening. Sleep well, and I'll see you in the next investigation.